Revolutions. They always seem to just erupt out of nowhere, right? These sudden, chaotic, world-changing explosions. But what if they're not so random? What if, kind of like a storm, they actually follow a pattern? Today, we're going to dissect the anatomy of a revolution to really understand the stages that can take a society from an old established order to a brand new and, let's be honest, often terrifying world.
All right, let's get into it. We're going to follow this 6-part playbook. First, we'll look at what makes a revolution even possible. Then, we'll watch the old world start to crumble and see how the spark of new ideas changes everything. From there, we'll witness the big explosion, try to navigate the messy aftermath, and finally, we'll size up the legacy that's forged in all that fire. So what is that tipping point? I mean, really, what is it? Just imagine you're in Paris. It's July 1789. The air is just thick with tension. An angry mob storms the Bastille, this huge fortress that's a symbol of everything they hate about the king. It's just pure, raw, revolutionary energy. But this didn't just happen overnight. What pushes normal people, shopkeepers, lawyers, farmers, to risk literally everything to overthrow their entire world? This quote from Robespierre, who became one of the most famous and frankly feared leaders of the French Revolution, just gets right to the heart of it. A revolution, at its core, is a battle of ideas. It's all about what people know, what they start to believe is possible, and what they're just not willing to put up with anymore. See, tyranny works best when people are kept in the dark. But freedom begins with an idea. And that leads us right into our next stage. The old order has to start crumbling. Before any of these new revolutionary ideas can really take root, the foundation of the old world has to be broken. A revolution can only really ignite when the way things are is already deeply flawed, brittle, and basically ready to collapse under its own weight. Kind of like a grand old house with a rotten foundation. So let's look at the classic example, pre-revolutionary France. They called it the old regime. This was a world run by an absolute monarch, a king whose power people believed came directly from God. So think about that. Challenging the king wasn't just treason. It was like challenging God himself. And society wasn't based on your talent or how hard you worked. It was a rigid pyramid you were born into. Your whole life was pretty much decided for you from day one. Now this is where it gets really nuts. This table breaks it down with cold, hard numbers. You had 3 classes, or estates. The first estate, the clergy, was less than 1% of the population but owned 10% of the land. The second estate, the rich nobles, were only 2% but they owned 20% of the land. And, get this, both of them paid almost 0 taxes. So who's left? The third estate. Everyone else. We're talking 97% of the population carrying almost the entire tax burden for the whole country. It's just completely upside down. And that's the key thing to understand, right? This wasn't just numbers on a spreadsheet. This was a tale of 2 completely different realities. If you were in the privileged estates, you got all the top jobs and you paid no taxes. You probably thought all these new Enlightenment ideas were dangerous. But if you were in the third estate, you had absolutely no say in your government, you got taxed on everything you touched, and you were desperately clinging to those very same ideas about liberty and equality. The system wasn't just unfair, it was designed to be unfair. So, being broke and feeling like the system is rigged against you, well, that creates a lot of anger. But anger alone just kind of simmers. It might cause a bread riot, but it doesn't topple a kingdom. To get a real revolution, you need a spark. You need new ideas that don't just tell people what's wrong with their world, but actually paint a picture of how a new, better world could work. It gives them something to fight for. And this right here, this is the kind of spark we're talking about. This one sentence from the philosopher Rousseau was absolutely electric at the time. It basically said that all this stuff, the king, the nobles, the rigid classes, those chains were not natural. They weren't from God. They were man-made. And here's the kicker. If they were man-made, they could be unmade. This simple idea gave millions of people the permission they needed to demand their freedom. But the spark doesn't always look the same. In France, it was the Enlightenment. But over a century later, in Russia, it was a totally different idea that lit the match: communism. This was a radical vision where workers would seize power, private property would disappear, and everything would be shared equally by everyone. For the peasants and factory workers in Tsarist Russia who were living in brutal conditions, this was a vision just as powerful and just as worth dying for as liberty was in France. So, you've got a crumbling old order, you've got a powerful new idea, you mix them together, maybe throw in a bad economy or a lost war, And you get stage 4, the explosion. This is it. This is the moment the world turns completely upside down. It's when governments collapse, authority just vanishes, and the streets fill with chaos and violence and change that can never be undone.
And in France, the explosion was just unbelievably fast. I mean, think about the speed of this. In July 1789, the Bastille falls. Just 1 month later, the entire system of feudalism, a system that had defined Europe for centuries, is just gone. Less than 4 years after that, the king himself is executed by guillotine. Then comes the Reign of Terror, this period of just insane paranoia and violence, which only ends when its main architect, Robespierre, is also executed. The pace of it all is just staggering.
17,000. That was the official number of people executed by the state during that single year of the Reign of Terror. And that doesn't even count the thousands more who died in prison or were just killed by mobs. This wasn't some clean, philosophical debate anymore. This was a bloodbath, a brutal reminder of the real cost of turning the world upside down. And that brings us to the next stage, the deeply unsettled aftermath. See, destroying the old world is one thing, but it doesn't automatically create a stable new one. What it usually creates is a power vacuum, and that leads to infighting, the rise of extremists, and that tragic thing you always hear about, where the revolution devours its own children. This slide just lays out the tragic irony of what came next. The beautiful promise of the revolution was liberty, equality, fraternity. But what was the reality? Well, liberty became the Reign of Terror. The dream of equality was replaced by the rise of a military dictator. And fraternity? It turned into years of brutal civil war and wars with other countries. Because in the middle of all that instability and bloodshed, people just get exhausted. They start to crave one thing more than anything else: order. Any order will do. And that is the perfect environment for a new strong man to step in. After a decade of chaos, France was more than ready for someone like Napoleon Bonaparte to seize power, restore stability, and in doing so, basically end the whole dream of a democratic republic. We see a really similar, maybe even more extreme pattern in Russia. The dream of a classless communist utopia curdled into one of the most brutal forms of government ever created: totalitarianism. Under Stalin, the state didn't just control the economy. It tried to control everything, every aspect of your life, public and private, enforced by secret police and a culture of constant fear. The desperate craving for order found its most terrifying end. So given all of that, the terror, the chaos, the dictators, what's the final legacy? After the fire burns out, what's actually left standing? This final stage is all about zooming out and looking at the long-term global impact, how these massive upheavals still shape the world we live in today. Well, despite their horrific costs, their impact is just undeniable. Revolutions like the one in France and the American one around the same time spread the ideals of democracy and individual rights all over the world. They inspired countless independence movements. The Russian Revolution put communism on the map as a global force that would define world politics for 70 years. But maybe the biggest thing they all did was prove that radical, fundamental change was possible, that the world didn't have to be the way it always had been. Which leaves us with this final, really difficult question, doesn't it? We've seen the whole anatomy, from the rotten old system to the fiery aftermath. Revolutions have the power to destroy a world, for sure, but can they reliably build a better one? And when you look at the staggering human cost, you have to ask yourself, is the price of that change a price worth paying? And that, right there, is the complicated and often paradoxical legacy of revolution.